the Surya Siddhanta. I know that's a little bit mathematical in its orientation, but then astronomy is like that. Astronomy is the most ancient division of mathematical science, actually. And that's true in India also. Of course, I was pointing out, a lot of mathematics that we have today comes originally from India. It's an interesting point. For example, the so-called Pythagorean theorem is found in the Silpa Shastra, which is part of the Atharva Veda. And it's a general form of the theorem. Sometimes they'll say, well, certain ancient peoples had special cases, but they didn't have the theorem in its general form. But in the Silpa Shastra, it gives the most general form of the Pythagorean theorem. So they had geometry, and they could solve all kinds of complicated geometrical problems. These were involved in building sacrificial altars. Apparently, they would want to do such a thing. Well, they'd have, say, an altar in the shape of an eagle, very precise shape, defined geometrically. And there would be the problem of making an altar of the same shape, but with twice the area. Now, how would you solve that? You have to double the area, but they could do it using their geometrical constructions. So that's in the Silpa Shastra. Then algebra really comes from India. We get it from the Arabs, but it's there in India. And trigonometry, as I mentioned yesterday. And while I'm on the subject, in the very last part of the book, I'll just mention this thing, which is kind of interesting. This business of calculating pi to many decimal places was a favorite pastime in India. So there's a 14th century Indian mathematician named Madhava, and he gave the following approximation for pi. It's 3.14159265259. And he lived in South India sometime in the 14th century. So, in any case, the purpose in discussing the Surya Siddhanta was to lay the groundwork for understanding the fifth canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Because in order to understand the fifth canto, it's important to have an idea of where the different structures are that are mentioned in the fifth canto. I'm going to talk about the fifth canto proper tomorrow, but when I go over that, we'll be discussing such things as Mount Meru, Jambudweep, Bhumandala, and so forth. And we'll be interested in knowing where they are in the universe. So this introduction involving the Surya Siddhanta will help us in identifying where these different structures are, so we can get an idea of what the fifth canto is really saying. But before coming to that, there's some additional preparatory work which is important for understanding the fifth canto. And that involves understanding the nature of matter. So that's what I want to talk about today. So in the book, this corresponds to the second chapter, which I call Vedic Physics, the nature of space, time, and matter. So the basic point to make is that in the Vedic literature, the universe has many levels of experience. In effect, there are what you could call parallel worlds, so that you may have experiences on one level, so you see a certain world, you have certain experiences. And this is based on your karma and a particular arrangement of your senses. However, by altering the arrangement of your senses, you can experience another world which, in effect, is in the same place. So in the book, I use the term higher dimensional to refer to this. In the Vedic literature, as far as I'm aware, there's no Sanskrit word that corresponds to this term higher dimensional. It's a modern mathematical term. However, it's a useful word for referring to certain basic properties of space and time which are implicit in the Vedic literature. So I'll give you a few examples of what I'm talking about, and then we can consider the general principles involved. So one example of what you could call a parallel or higher dimensional reality is provided by Vrindavan. It's a rather essential example. We're told that the entire spiritual world is there in Vrindavan. Now, if an ordinary person goes to Vrindavan, he sees an ordinary earthly village with buildings and streets and people and so forth. But if the person is at a higher level of spiritual awareness, then he can see the actual reality of Vrindavan. There's the whole Brahma Vimohana Lila, in which Krishna revealed to Brahma the reality of Vrindavan. And Brahma was totally astonished by what he saw, so much so that he actually fainted. So the point then is that the ordinary world is there in Vrindavan that we see and experience, and this transcendental world is also there. And it's a question of the level of consciousness of the individual as to which world you can experience. So you might say, well, this is an entirely spiritual example. There are material examples also. For example, in the Himalayas, there's a place called Kalapagram, which is mentioned, I think, mainly in the 8th canto of the Bhagavatam. So this is a place where representatives of the Surya Vamsa and the Soma Vamsa are waiting out the Kali Yuga. The idea is that these are dynasties of kings descending from the sun god and the moon god. And they're referred to quite a bit in the Bhagavatam. And you can see that these dynasties go through many different yuga cycles. But it's also described in the Bhagavatam that these dynasties become degraded and die out during the Kali Yuga. I think it's, which canto is it? One of the 12th, maybe, yeah. One of the later cantos describes the remaining members of the Surya Vamsa in the Kali Yuga. And it comes down to within about 1,000 years of our own time, if you add up the ages or the periods of reign of these different kings. And then the dynasty peters out. But there are representatives of these dynasties who are staying in this place called Kalapagram. And they're said in the Bhagavatam to be they're practicing yoga to slow down the functions of their body so that they can essentially go into a state of suspended animation and wait out the Kali Yuga. Then in the next Satya Yuga, they'll become kings again. So they're there, but who can see them? And that's in the Himalayas. So that's a more material or mundane example of parallel reality. Another interesting transcendental example is provided by Navadvip. If you look in the Navadvip Mahatmya, you'll see it's described that there's a transcendental city in Navadvip, and it's there right now. But people with ordinary vision can't see it. So there's a sort of multi-level aspect to the universe. These are a few examples. What I want to do is describe some of the basic principles which will enable us to get a grasp of this multi-level feature of the universe. So the thing to do to explain this is to start with the position of Krishna. Of course, in this class on the Chatura Shloki, there's that verse in which we learn that before, during, and after the creation, there's nothing but Krishna. So that means then that in some sense, namely in the sense of the Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva, the material energy is Krishna. Now this has important implications concerning the nature of matter. We don't usually look at it that way. In fact, there may be a tendency to think that matter is the ordinary stuff that we conceive of on the basis of our general education. Three-dimensional, made of little molecules and particles and so forth. And Krishna somehow is all-pervading within that. One might have an impression like that. So in effect, what one visualizes is this. One takes one's image of matter and space, and then one adds Krishna, and you add him everywhere. And then you say, well, that's pretty hard to conceive of, so we'll say that's inconceivable. So you could think of it in that way. It's natural to think of it in that way. But that's not actually the proper understanding. Because if you adopt that approach to understanding the position of Krishna, then you're making Krishna relative to space and matter. Whereas Krishna is actually the absolute source of everything, and space and matter are relative to Krishna. So, in order to understand the actual nature of matter, the thing to do is start with Krishna. Actually, when I was in Vrindavan once, a man gave me an argument in favor of the Mayavadi doctrine, based on this idea that Krishna is in ordinary space. So he pointed to a picture of Krishna on a poster. He said, well, this could not be the absolute truth. And here's why. You see, here's Krishna's arm. Okay? Now go a little bit beneath his arm, and there's empty space. And go a bit further down, well, there's his foot. Go a bit further down, well, there's more space. So Krishna's relative. So how could he be the absolute truth? This was his argument. But of course, this is based on a misconception. So in the Brahma Samhita, there's a fairly succinct description of Krishna's position, which is very interesting. There are two verses in particular which I'd like to read. The first one is, I worship Govinda, the primeval Lord, whose transcendental form is full of bliss, truth, substantiality, and is thus full of the most dazzling splendor. Each of the limbs of that transcendental figure possesses in himself the full-fledged functions of all the organs, and eternally sees, maintains, and manifests the infinite universes, both spiritual and mundane. So this provides a sort of basic axiom describing the nature of Krishna's form. And you can see that it's not like material form. A material form, as we normally conceive of it, is made up of a number of little parts that are just juxtaposed next to one another. And the idea in physics is there are some kind of forces that hold these parts together, not very strongly. Thus, if you take an ordinary human body, these parts are temporarily stuck together and they tend to come unstuck, unfortunately. And in a sense, the body then is unreal, because the only thing that's really there are the parts. That's what we were talking about in connection with the simulated worlds and so forth. But Krishna's body is not like that. We find Krishna's body has parts, limbs, head, arms, fingers, and so forth, but each part of Krishna's body is the totality of Krishna. Now, materially, this is inconceivable. But then this is not supposed to be a description of matter. This is the starting point for understanding Krishna. So that is you can say, is an initial axiom. That Krishna has variegated form, but he's perfectly unified because each part of that form is the totality of Krishna. So, believe it or not, this is going to tell us something about the nature of space and matter. And actually that's not so hard to understand, because space and matter are produced by Krishna. So, to get to the topic of space and matter, we'll go to another verse. This one says, he is an undifferentiated entity, as there is no distinction between potency and the possessor thereof. In his work of creation of millions of worlds, his potency remains inseparable. All the universes exist in him, and he is present in his fullness in every one of the atoms that are scattered throughout the universe at one and the same time. Such is the primeval Lord whom I adore. So, this verse is making a rather interesting statement, because it is saying that the universes exist in Krishna. So, all right, here's Krishna, and imagine a universe in him. Now imagine taking one atom in that universe. Well, Krishna is fully present in that atom. So there's Krishna, and there's the universe in him, and the atom in the universe, and he, in his fullness, is present within the atom. So you say, well, that's materially impossible. But once again, it's an axiomatic situation. This is the situation of Krishna. Śrīla Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati in his purport emphasizes this point. Let's see, where is this? Yeah, he says, again, his abode is beyond human conception, since all worlds, limited and spiritual, exist in him, and he resides simultaneously in his fullness and entirety in all the atoms in all the worlds. So, that is the situation of Krishna. So,
what was the text?
Which text?
Yeah.
Oh, these. Well, this is text 35 that I was just reading, and the one before was text 32 in the Brahma Samhita. So, you can see then that this idea that Krishna is situated in space is not the correct idea. Actually, space is defined by Krishna, and all the space in the universe is within Krishna, and Krishna is present at every point within space. So this idea of Krishna being present in space can be looked at another way, and that is by saying that Krishna has direct access to every point in space. Every location is right where Krishna is. That's just another way to say he is in every location, because Krishna is one. Just like in the Bhagavad Gita, also it is stated, the super soul appears to be divided, but actually he's situated as one. So it's not really that there are lots of little super souls in all of the different atoms. There's one super soul, and he is everywhere, simultaneously. So that means that in a sense, all the points in space are in the same place, at least from the perspective of Krishna. And because of that, he doesn't have to travel in order to go anywhere. There are many different examples of that. For example, when the embryo of Parikshit in Uttara's womb was being burned, and Krishna appeared to save him, Śrīla Prabhupāda commented in the purport that Krishna didn't have to travel in order to appear there. He was actually already there, and so on. So, this says something then about the nature of space. Basically, if space and matter in the ultimate issue are Krishna, as that Chatur Shloki verse is saying, then matter must have potencies beyond what we ordinarily think of and what we ordinarily experience. In fact, all the potencies that Krishna have must be there. So this leads to all kinds of possibilities. To give an idea of what it implies, I'm going to read for you a passage from the Chaitanya Charitamrita that always very much intrigued me, and I have it in the book here. This tells about a visit of Brahma to Krishna in Dwarka. So it's quite intriguing. Brahma came to see Krishna, and he was waiting. Apparently there were lots of important demigods waiting to see Krishna. And so Krishna's secretary told Brahma, he came out and said, Krishna wants to know which Brahma has come to see him. And Brahma was immediately a bit surprised at this. He thought, well, I'm the only Brahma in this universe. What's he talking about? So, when Brahma came in to see Krishna finally, the following conversation took place. So, Krishna said, or rather Brahma said to Krishna, why did you inquire which Brahma had come to see you? What is the purpose of such an inquiry? Is there any other Brahma besides me within this universe? Upon hearing this, Sri Krishna smiled and immediately meditated. Unlimited Brahmas arrived instantly. These Brahmas had different numbers of heads. Some had 10 heads, some 20, some 100, some 1,000, some 10,000, some 100,000, some 10 million, and others 100 million. No one can count the number of faces they had. There also arrived many Lord Shivas with various heads, numbering 100,000 and 10 million. Many Indras also arrived, and they had thousands of eyes all over their bodies. When the four-headed Brahma of this universe saw all these opulences of Krishna, he became very bewildered and considered himself a rabbit among many elephants. All the Brahmas who came to see Krishna offered their respects at his lotus feet, and when they did this, their helmets touched his lotus feet. No one can estimate the inconceivable potencies of Krishna. All the Brahmas who were there were resting in the one body of Krishna. When all the helmets struck together at Krishna's lotus feet, there was a tumultuous sound. It appeared that the helmets themselves were offering prayers unto Krishna's lotus feet. With folded hands, all the Brahmas and Shivas began to offer prayers unto Lord Krishna, saying, O Lord, you have shown me a great favor. I have been able to see your lotus feet. Each of them then said, "It is my great fortune, Lord, that you have called me, thinking of me as your servant. Now let me know what your order is, so that I may carry it on my heads." Lord Krishna replied, "Since I wanted to see all of you together, I have called all of you here. All of you should be happy. Is there any fear of the demons?" They replied, "By your mercy we are victorious everywhere. Whatever burden there was upon the earth, you have taken away by descending on that planet. This is the proof of Dwarka's opulence. All the Brahmas thought, Krishna is now staying in my jurisdiction." Thus the opulence of Dwarka was perceived by each and every one of them. Although they were all assembled together, no one could see anyone but himself. So this is the final point here, that all of these different Brahmas were summoned by Krishna. But each Brahma, except for our Brahma, thought that he was alone with Krishna. So that means each Brahma went to see Krishna in his own universe, in Dwarka. So Krishna was manifesting Dwarka in all of those different universes simultaneously. So Krishna and Dwarka, in that one room within Dwarka, were in all of the universes all at once. And our Brahma could see that, but each of the other Brahmas could only see himself with Krishna. So this indicates what I mean by higher dimensional space. I use the word higher dimensional space to refer to this kind of thing. Yeah?
When you were discussing religious truth today, I asked the question that when Krishna was speaking to Lord Brahma to instruct him, was he simultaneously instructing all the Brahmas in all universes simultaneously, or just our Brahma?
For all we know there, he was just discussing our Brahma, as far as we're told. But in this passage right here, we're told explicitly, of course, that he was speaking to all of these different Brahmas. And he was speaking to them all individually. And our Brahma was given the vision to see all of that. That's similar to Arjuna being given the vision to see the universal form. So here we have this situation, which in terms of three-dimensional space is not possible. Now you might say, well, this is a particular example involving Krishna and Dwarka and so forth. But it also involves Brahma, the different Brahmas, and their universes, and so on. In other words, it involves the total picture of reality. So we see that there's this, what I refer to as multidimensionality of space. As I say, I'm using that term. It's a term borrowed from mathematics, but it's a convenient term to refer to this kind of thing. Now, there's some more things you can say about it. Let me first of all indicate something about the mathematical analogy. It's only an analogy. You can define, in mathematics, you see, historically, there's what they call Euclidean geometry, which you may study in school. So that has a very long history. And people have tended to think of space in terms of Euclidean geometry in the West, simply as a matter of tradition. So in Euclidean geometry, you have planes and points and lines and so forth, and different axioms. So people tend to think of space in those terms. But in more recent times, in mathematics, so-called higher dimensional spaces have been studied. And there are all kinds of different things that you can do. For example, if you think of this piece of paper as a plane, you can bend it in another dimension, namely the third dimension, and bring 2 points together. And in that case, those 2 points are very close together because of the bending of the paper, whereas they were widely separated initially. That is, initially you'd have to go from here to here to get between those 2 points. But when it's bent like this, you can cross over directly. So if you can bend something in a higher dimensional space, all kinds of different transformations become possible. Now, it turns out that there are things called mystic cities that we read about, mystic powers. And they also shed some light on this issue. For example, there's the Prapti Siddhi. Śrīla Prabhupāda gives a couple interesting examples of that. One of them is in the early part of the Nectar of Devotion. He says with the Prapti Siddhi, a yogi who has this power could reach out his hand, let's say he's in New Delhi, reach out his hand to some place in Afghanistan and take some pomegranates. And they'll appear in his hand there in New Delhi. So, in effect, he's been able to reach to a distant place and take a physical object. So this isn't simply a matter of some kind of subtle out-of-body travel or astral travel, but because he's moving real physical pomegranates. And they were in Afghanistan, and now they're there in New Delhi. So that is an example of something which, at least by analogy, we can think of in terms of this example of the paper. At least such a thing is not possible in ordinary three-dimensional space. But the idea of higher dimensional space at least gives an idea of how that could be possible. In any case, the Vedic literature describes that this kind of thing is going on. So the basic point that I want to make then is that these mystic potencies also imply something about the nature of space. Now the interesting thing is that the mystic potencies are obtainable by borrowing Krishna's potency. In other words, all of these different mystic potencies are actually the potency of Krishna manifested in the given individual person to a limited degree. So if Krishna is everywhere at once, and Krishna gives you a little bit of his potency, then you can also transcend the ordinary limits of space and go to some other place instantaneously. Also, there is the possibility of changes of scale. Krishna is not just everywhere at once, but he exists at all possible size levels. He exists as being smaller than the smallest and also greater than the greatest. So by borrowing the potency of Krishna, you can also experience space in the same way. So that's described in some detail in the Bhagavatam. I thought I'd read you a few examples of that because it's kind of interesting. For example, here Krishna is speaking to Uddhava here. This is in the 11th canto. It's in chapter 15, actually. So he says here, one who worships me in my atomic form, pervading all subtle elements, fixing his mind on that alone, obtains the mystic perfection called anima. So anima is the mystic power to become smaller than the smallest. So according to this, if you meditate on Krishna's feature as smaller than the smallest, you can acquire that power from him. In that case, you can become very minute and enter into the atoms and so forth. Or conversely, one who absorbs his mind in the particular form of the Mahatattva and thus meditates upon me as the supreme soul of the total material existence achieves the mystic perfection called Mahima, or Mahima actually. By further absorbing the mind in the situation of each individual element, such as the sky, air, fire, and so on, one progressively acquires the greatness of each material element. So here's the case where this Mahima Siddhi is the power to expand oneself enormously. So these can be looked at as indications of the nature of space as understood in the Vedic literature. As I say, perhaps the first way one would think about these things is to think of space as being a fixed framework given by Euclidean geometry and imagine that somehow these things can take place within space. But actually we see here that these potencies are obtained by acquiring a small amount of Krishna's potency. And Krishna has the feature that he is everywhere in space. He's simultaneously includes all the universes within him, and he's also within every atom within the universes. So by borrowing Krishna's potency, the individual can also experience space in this way. So the basic point then is that space and time have properties that are somewhat different from what we normally experience. So the Vedic literature contains all kinds of stories which implicitly make use of this understanding. All kinds of things happen which would be rather difficult to understand in terms of ordinary three-dimensional space. To give another example, which is material, consider the demon Banasura, who had 1,000 arms. You can consider that one. It was described that with his 1,000 arms, he was working 500 bows simultaneously and firing arrows at Krishna in that big battle that they had. So, if you think about that, you can see that there could be some problems with that description because, you may say the arms are somehow subtle so they can pass through each other, but what about the bows? If you've got 500 bows, see there are 360 degrees in a full circle. So with 500 bows, you'd have less than 1 degree per bow if you went around in a complete circle, but actually he was aiming them all in one direction. So why didn't the bows get in the way of one another? And you might say, well, they pass through each other. Well, then why didn't the bowstrings pass through the arrows? It's a little bit hard to make the whole thing work because you could say, well, a given arrow has to be propelled by its bowstring, but it has to pass through all the other bowstrings that are there. The things will get in the way of each other. And then the arrows, presumably once they're launched, they'll make definite holes in people. So it can't be that they just pass through things. So how could it be? But you can see, though, if you can have higher dimensional space, such a thing becomes possible. And of course, in this description that I just read about the different heads on the body of Lord Brahma, you can see problems there also. Rather large numbers of heads were being mentioned, 10 millions and hundreds of millions and so forth. So how do you work that out anatomically? But again, if you can have higher dimensional space, then that becomes possible.
How do they simultaneously touch Krishna's feet?
Yeah.
Big feet.
Have to be pretty big feet. Yeah, or how do you have 500 arms coming out of one shoulder? You make them as thin as hairs. Actually, you can see that in paintings. You know, artists have a lot of trouble with some of the different pastimes.
This is two dimensions. I don't disagree with three dimensions.
Yeah, for example, there's the Kaliya serpent. I've seen paintings in which you see this enormously thick trunk and then these very thin heads coming out in order to fit all those heads onto one basic trunk. But in any case, there are many different things like this. So the idea is that there's a multidimensionality of space which is implicit in the Vedic literature. And there's the idea of parallel worlds and connections between worlds and so forth. So that was the basic idea that I wanted to convey in this whole subject of the Vedic physics. Yeah?
Is this, I mean, we're conditioned to see this world as three-dimensional.
Yeah.
What we see. And it doesn't talk like that in the Vedic literature, but is it actually that they didn't see it like that there's some other way of considering the space, that they didn't see that three-dimensionality, they didn't take notice of it? Why isn't this, or were they seeing something different than what we're seeing?
I think that people saw the same thing that we see under normal circumstances. After all, you also read of the 10 directions in the Vedic literature, and those are north, south, east, and west, and then the combinations northeast, northwest, and so on. So that makes 8, and then up and down. So those are the 10 directions. So that seems pretty three-dimensional. But there's all kinds of references also to what we might call mystical operations, which many people in Vedic times, let's say, were able to perform. Another example that comes to mind is this matter of traveling to a distant place by entering into a river, such as the Ganges. Śrīla Prabhupāda said that even today there are some yogis who can enter into the Ganges somewhere up near Haridwar, and they emerge for the Kumbh Mela, I guess near Allahabad. And it's not that they swam underwater all the way. somehow you just enter into the river at one point and you emerge at another point, which again is a higher dimensional type of thing, similar to that Prapti city, it would seem. You might ask, what is the role of the river in that? I don't really know. Maybe it's a sort of guiding beacon or something. There are descriptions in the Bhagavatam that this method can be used to travel from the higher planets to the lower planets. It's described that the four Kumaras were in Satyaloka, and they went to visit Ananta Shesha. So they entered the Ganges, went down to the lower planets, down to where Ananta Shesha was, and emerged, and it said their hair was wet when they came out of the Ganges. So there are all kinds of descriptions of, you might say, higher dimensional experience. And there are many different things of that sort. Just, for example, when Indra was stealing the sacrificial horse from Maharaj Prithu, and Maharaj Prithu's son went chasing after Indra, and he just automatically flew through outer space, chasing him. So it seems that people sort of had ordinary experience some of the time walking around on the earth in an ordinary way, but then, in the case of this person, he just took off into the ether. Oh, by the way, another interesting point is that Śrīla Prabhupāda very often, especially in the Krishna book, refers to traveling in outer space. And one might get the impression that this is something like the astronauts going up into outer space. But as far as I can see, it really means traveling in the ether, the element of ether. It doesn't mean that you have to go up through the atmosphere, out beyond the ionosphere and so on, and then travel through space and come back down. For example, there's that story in which, Aniruddha was kidnapped by that mystic yogini, Chitralekha. So, without even waking him up, she flew through space and picked him up and took him to this city, I guess Sonitapura or something, hundreds of miles away from Dwarka. And so then there he was. So this appears to be an ability to move through the ether. Another interesting point in this Bhagavatam volume, by the way, stresses the fact that you can move gross bodies this way. I just saw this. It's one of those that I have labeled here. I had a whole series of them. This is it. This is text 22 in chapter 15. It says, "The yogi who completely absorbs his mind in me, and who then makes use of the wind that follows the mind to absorb the material body in me, obtains through the potency of meditation on me the mystic perfection by which his body immediately follows his mind wherever it goes."
Hanuman was able to, when he was little, tried to grab his son and flew pretty close to it.
Well, yeah, there are so many descriptions of these things. What's described here is that you can move your gross body to another part of the universe, going at the speed of the mind and so forth. Yeah?
That would mean that some of the laws govern the gross body that we know would be suspended, like how does one breathe, air while traveling in ether, things like that.
Yeah, apparently so. Another way to look at it is that the laws that we know of in our ordinary experience are special cases of more general laws. So when these kinds of things are done, presumably the more general laws are being invoked. We have experience of that kind of thing. If you consider the fact that nowadays we have electronics, so we can do all kinds of things with electricity. So the potency of electricity was always there in matter, but until about 100 years ago, nobody ever did anything with it, at least within our historical period. So all that potency was there, but nobody knew anything about it. Now we know about it, and so we have radio and television and electric lights and so on. So similarly, these would be potencies that are there in matter, in the material universe, but we don't know how to take advantage of them. But then there are other personalities that do. Yeah?
When you talked about so many things, like so many arms mounted on the shoulder or heads,
Mm-hmm.
Is it that becomes possible in the higher dimensional model, because you're saying that we can have more than one thing in what we would consider the same place.
Yeah.
But somebody else doesn't consider it the same place.
Yes, that's right. In fact, you can even make a computer model of in 4 dimensions of a 4-armed form. I tried this. It was pretty crude. Actually, I only had a 64K computer to do that with. So I just used blocks to make it. So I used 4-dimensional blocks. People know about these things. So, ever see a 4-dimensional block? I'll make a drawing of one for you.
I thought the 4th dimension was time.
Well, the 4th dimension can be a spatial dimension. If you take an ordinary box like this, and then you need to extend each of these lines and connect them like this. Oops, I forgot 2 extensions. There we go.
Hypercube?
Yeah, this is a hypercube. It's called a tesseract also. I just have to connect all the lines now. I have to stand back from it and see where they all are. Let's see. Not quite. I think I misconnected some lines here, I'm afraid. Wait a minute. Where does this go?
That's right.
Yeah, one to your left.
Well, I do something up, that's for sure.
That's all. If we would leave this, then all the rest of it would work probably also, right?
Well, basically, you can do this with mathematics. You can have a 4-dimensional cube, a hypercube. So, just as you can take ordinary 3-dimensional cubes and put them together to make a figure, somewhat crude, blockish-looking figure, you can take 4-dimensional hypercubes and put them together in 4-dimensional space. And you can make a figure. And using a computer, just as you saw with this computer graphics, you can take a 3-dimensional model of something generated in the computer and project that onto the 2-dimensional screen, and you see it as a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional thing. Well, you can do the same thing with a 4-dimensional object. You can also project it onto a screen, and you can rotate it in 4 dimensions and look at it from various angles. So I tried that out. You get some quite remarkable looking pictures, but I arranged the thing with 2 arms coming out of each shoulder. So it would be interesting, by the way, to make a more realistic model of that with a more powerful computer. Actually, people do this kind of thing. There are a number of videos showing higher dimensional surfaces projected into 2D and then rotated in the higher dimensional space. These are used in some mathematics classes. And what you see on the screen are all these amazing transformations taking place, but really it corresponds to the rotation of the higher dimensional surface. So it's because of that sort of thing that I really adopted this term higher dimensional, although I should stress it's only really a metaphor for the actual reality. And there are a lot of things involved here in which I don't really understand how they work. For example, I don't really know how the Prapti Siddhi works, that is, how that yogi can reach for the object at a distance. But the basic principle, though, behind it is easy enough to understand. Namely, if Krishna is a unified being who at the same time has diverse features, and he is simultaneously at all points in space, and actually is the very definition of all the points in space, then these kinds of things are possible. And then the details, of course, would be, a vast subject known only to Krishna ultimately. But of course, yogis at different levels of advancement would know the whole system at different levels of detail beyond what we're aware of. So that is a basic foundation then. Is there any other questions? Yeah?
So we're talking about how a yogi meditating on a certain aspect of Krishna can attain a particular city, how does this relate to the fact that we know some of these demons and, they're expanding themselves into great sizes now? We can't conclude that they were meditating on Krishna, seeing that city.
Yeah, that's been answered. I think in a purport here it mentions that one can obtain a perverted reflection of these cities also, and the demons are allowed to do that. So Krishna is facilitating their sense gratification. It's an educational experience to be a demon. Yeah.
Doesn't modern science have this conception of 7, 8 different dimensions?
Yes, that's an interesting point. I should mention something about modern science, because you might say this idea of higher dimensional space is really rather far out. But in modern science, you find these kinds of ideas. First of all, in mathematics, generally subjects such as linear algebra and so on are presented in terms of n-dimensional space. They don't even bother with 3 dimensions. They make it n, where n could be anything. But then in physics, where they're talking about the real world, it turns out, first of all, that quantum mechanics assumes really the necessity of an infinite dimensional space simply to define atoms. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but if you take, say, a carbon atom, which has, well, that's the way you define one carbon atom in quantum mechanics. You need that. If you try to do it just in 3-dimensional space, it won't work. All the physics breaks down. Yeah?
If the electron isn't really a discrete unit, and if it's existing as some sort of wave, then how does that fit in with the idea of the electron also being a distinct unit with certain distinct electrical charges that's irreducible?
Yes. Quantum mechanics is an amazing subject. That's a good question. What you have are, well, it's a whole thing to go into in quantum mechanics. But, yes, you have, actually, just to sum up the basic point, I was once speaking to this British physicist, Sir Brian Pippard, at Cavendish Laboratory, and he said to me that the moment you think of 2 electrons, you're lost. He said it's a total misconception to think that there are 2 electrons. In effect, there's 1 electron. Because I just said, I spoke of a carbon atom, and I said, well, you need 18-dimensional space. Now, guess what you need to have 2 carbon atoms? 36. That's right. You need 36-dimensional space to talk about the electrons in 2 carbon atoms. So all the electrons in 2 carbon atoms, that's really 1 electron, so to speak, moving in 36-dimensional space. Now if you go to 3, 4, etc. carbon atoms, you just keep multiplying the numbers of spatial dimensions. So quantum mechanics is actually defined in terms of something they call Hilbert space, which is infinite dimensional space. That's the way quantum mechanics works. So the point can be made that if in physics, and one should keep in mind quantum mechanics isn't just some strange esoteric theory, but it's the foundation of modern chemistry. And chemical reactions are understood in those terms.
They can't even agree whether it's wave or particle, light or electron for that matter.
If you look at the actual theory, it's all wave and there's no particles. But the really mysterious thing is that the wave suddenly reorients itself by jumps. And the jumps correspond to what they speak of as particles. I have to give you some descriptions to clarify that. That's a pretty obscure statement. But it's a very remarkable theory. The strange thing about it is that it works.
By behavior. The behavior is like that of a particle. Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes it's like that of a particle.
And sometimes like that of a wave.
Yeah. I'd have to draw a whole bunch of diagrams to explain how that works out. But the basic point to make there is that they're dealing with higher dimensional space just to define atoms and molecules. So already then that means this whole idea has been introduced into modern science. The Vedic literature is going much further than that, but the ideas are there.
What are they waves of?
Well, no one would be able to say what they're waves of. That's a question I asked when I first studied this. Actually, I was in high school, and I studied this thing, so I said, well, what is this wave oscillating in? I said, that's totally the wrong question to ask. Just take it as an axiomatic starting point. You start with this wave. We don't ask what it's oscillating in, or what it's made of. That's not a fruitful question. So, one shouldn't laugh at that, though. That's actually a valid approach, because it's the same approach that I was just advocating for understanding Krishna. That is, in the Brahma Samhita, you have this description of the way Krishna is, that each part of his transcendental body is identical to the totality. Now, you could say, well, how are we to understand that? What's his body made of, anyway? But the answer would be that that's the wrong question. Actually, this is the starting point. Krishna is like this, and then other things can be understood in terms of this. This is what they call the axiomatic method. And in fact, it's quite ancient and respectable. For example, I mentioned Euclidean geometry. Well, Euclidean geometry is defined in terms of axioms. 2 points determine one straight line, and so on and so forth. So how do you know that these axioms are true? Well, you don't. Actually, it's interesting. In the history of geometry, for many years people thought that these axioms of Euclidean geometry are somehow intuitively obvious. That is, they're obviously true, and you can just tell that by looking at them. But then somebody came along and defined a geometry with different axioms, and it was just as good as Euclidean geometry, the so-called non-Euclidean geometry. And then they realized those axioms are not obviously true because you could have something different, which would be just as good. So the basic idea is that axioms are starting points. And if you have the right starting points, then you'll be able to draw the right conclusions. The whole idea of logic has to start with something that is never proven. Because if you start at a certain point and reason, and finally come back to your original conclusion, that's called circular reasoning, which is invalid. Now, if it's not circular, it has to start somewhere. And where it starts, that's a point where there's no proof preceding that. So that's the nature of logic. And that fits in nicely with the idea of a descending system for knowledge. In other words, if you're given from some absolute source some initial axioms that are actually correct, then you can safely apply logic and you'll get right conclusions all the way down the line. Whereas by the ascending process, you also have to have axioms, but where do you get them? So what scientists do using the ascending process is they say, well, okay, we need axioms, so they just try something out. They guess at a set of axioms. And then they work out the conclusions and see how well the conclusions hold up. And if they hold up pretty well, they say, well, we chose some pretty good axioms. But the trouble is, eventually, they come to believe that the axioms are absolute, because it's natural for people to think that way. Like I mentioned the other day, the problem with the scientists is that they're using the parampara system.
Right.
And the thing is, it's a parampara system that isn't coming from an absolute source. It's just coming from a guesswork originally. So, well, I guess this is the...
I have a few questions, guys. It's fairly simple, it's not so good.
Well, you better ask me later. Because now I'm supposed to have ended the class 5 minutes ago. But for the next... Am I wrong? Oh!
We have 30 minutes.
Oh, I misread the clock. Okay. Well,
There was a clock.
you can ask one question.
Okay, so I'm going to choose this one. According to, you give a reference to Krishna book of Madhuri Yashoda looking to Krishna's mouth and discovering a dirt, right? Or she was asking him, you ate dirt.
Right.
And she looked to his mouth and she saw all the universes within within Krishna's mouth. And beside that, she also saw herself looking to Krishna's mouth.
Right.
So that means that there is it works on similar patterns of motion. And I take a video camera, I will point it to this TV screen, and there will be the infinite regress representing himself like a giant yellow giant back, right?
Yeah. The difference though is that yes, you can point the TV camera at the screen, and you'll get an infinite regress of cameras and screens.
Yes.
But those are only images. But in this case, it's the actual reality. You see, this pastime in which Mother Yasoda looked into Krishna's mouth, because she heard he ate the dirt, she saw the universes, and she even saw herself in there. She was actually seeing herself. And that's an illustration of that verse in the Brahma Samhita, where Krishna says that the universes are within him. So Mother Yasoda looked into Krishna's mouth and saw herself, presumably looking into Krishna's mouth, I guess.
Yeah. And each of the universe has a similar value that has the material side and then reducing the material condition and becoming subtle into spiritual, or has different constitution.
Everything is ultimately spiritual. You see, this is also the discussion in that class on the chapter of Shloki, namely that everything that is seen to be separate from Krishna has no actual reality. Because everything that is actually real is actually not separate from Krishna. It's intimately part of Krishna. Ultimately, it is Krishna. And that's the Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. So the point then is that matter, we see it as being separate from Krishna. That's another point that was made there, that Krishna's illusory energy has the power to make us see things as being separate from Krishna. So it's by Krishna's power that we're seeing the absence of Krishna, and we're just seeing matter wherever we look. But Krishna is actually there everywhere, so all the potencies of Krishna are actually present everywhere in space.
I was just referring to the idea you said before about the Brahmas, so many Brahmas, so near the universe, so each individual material universe representing it simultaneously in one condition, in one particular time. So that means that how many Sadaputas exist within different universes?
There's no indication that there are any more Sadaputas. Brahma, by the way, is a post. Just like there are many presidents. There's only one, Bush or whoever it may be. But there are many different presidents, so there are many different Brahmas.
Well, I would imagine that this particular room have lots of different objects, living and unliving, and they have different shapes and different colors, different individualities, and behind those exact objects and exact its positions, there might be existing a parallel universe within exact condition.
Got a good imagination.
Yeah, so you can run wild in the imaginary fields of these ideas, but the point is, in the Vedic literature, you do have these different aspects of the universe. Now, yeah?
You're referring to Krishna as the ultimate axiom.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way we can go beyond that in terms of our understanding of Krishna?
Go beyond Krishna to understand Krishna?
Well, no, just in order to understand Krishna is just merely an axiom where we just leave off there, but can we understand Krishna in a deeper way?
Well, yes, by realization. You see, when you're talking about axioms and deductions and so on, you're talking about logic, reasoning, symbol manipulation. Of course, the real way to understand Krishna is ultimately by realization. You get to meet Krishna, and then you really know to the fullest extent that is possible for the jiva. So that's the ultimate way to know about Krishna. But meanwhile, one can look at it in terms of a framework of ideas. And that's useful for understanding the Vedic literature. So, let's see, for the next time, the thing to read is this third chapter. This gets into the actual subject matter of the fifth canto. And I'll say a little bit about it now since we have some time, but you can look this over. I know there's a lot of material here, and you don't have to, consider that you have to absorb all of this. it's just a good idea to get an overview. You can skim it over and just get an idea of what's there. So what I'm going to be doing then is discussing this material. So the starting point for the discussion of the universe is described in the 5th canto is the Earth. And so the Earth is described in the 5th canto as Bhumandala. And I translated this here, Middle Earth, because it's the middle planetary system. This Bhumandala is described in the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam essentially as a disk which is 50 koti yojanas in diameter. Koti is 10 million. So it's 500 million yojanas. And Śrīla Prabhupāda consistently uses the figure of 8 miles for 1 yojana. So that comes out to 4 billion miles in diameter. So that is the Earth as it's referred to in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So this, of course, can be a little bit perplexing, because you can say, well, what does that correspond to in our experience? Because we tend to think of the Earth as a globe. So how does this disk, 4 billion miles in diameter, correspond to a globe? So one idea that one might have is that, well, the Vedic literature is not even accepting the idea of the Earth as a globe. But that's one of the points regarding this description of the Surya Siddhanta that I was giving yesterday. Because the Surya Siddhanta describes the Earth as a globe. And in fact, it describes it as a globe of about the right size. There, you use a figure of 5 miles per yojana, and the Earth is a globe which is about 25,000 miles around the equator, which is the right value according to modern understanding.
How did it become 5?
The reason I would select 5 is that there are various distances mentioned in the Surya Siddhanta. There's the diameter of the Earth, there's the distance to the Moon, the diameter of the Moon, and diameters of different planets. And if you adopt 5 miles per yojana, then all of these agree with modern numbers. So that's the reason for thinking it's 5 miles. Now, in the Siddhanta Shiromani, that's another one of these Jyotisha Shastras written by Bhaskaracharya, the figure is, I think, 7.55 if you calculate in the same way, namely by matching all these distances. So those are 2 different scales. And as I mentioned yesterday, this astronomer Parameshwara comes right out and says there are 2 different scales used by astronomers for the yojana. So the 8-mile figure that Śrīla Prabhupāda uses is closer to the Siddhanta Shiromani figure. I've also seen references to a 6-mile yojana and so forth. So that's the question then. We have on the one hand the Earth globe described in terms of yojanas as having a diameter of 1,600 yojanas, and this 500 million yojana disk referred to as the Earth in the Bhagavatam. So what is the relation between the 2? Now, I was interested in checking to see what commentators on the Bhagavatam explicitly had to say on this subject. And I found some material which is contained here in the appendix of this book, specifically the first appendix. There are 2 appendices. What I have here is a translation, pretty much commentary and part translation, of some remarks made by a commentator on the Bhagavatam named Vamsidhar. Now this was obtained from the volumes that Śrīla Prabhupāda used for Bhagavatam commentaries. There's some large green volumes that he would consult, which had, I think they had 11 different commentaries by different authorities. Yeah?
I was concerned that when you said that, you said that it was in the same volume. People might might become confused and think that therefore it's automatically a bona fide commentary, but you don't say that explicitly.
I say explicitly in the book that actually I don't think it's necessarily bona fide. What my purpose...
I didn't think there was any.
Yes, it's in this appendix. Have you read the appendix?
Yeah.
Well, perhaps I didn't make it suitably clear, but I definitely said it in here. I say, where do I say it? That basically he's speculating. But you might say, then what is the value? The value of it is that it shows what Vaishnavas were thinking about the fifth canto as opposed to the Jyotisha Shastra in that time period, which was before the European invasion. This Vamsidhar was active in 1642. I don't know any other dates concerning his life, but according to what I was able to find, he was writing things, so he was mature in 1642 AD. So, yeah, it's after Lord Chaitanya. Another point to make is that in the fifth canto, Śrīla Prabhupāda at one point quotes verbatim a very large chunk of Sanskrit, which he attributes to, what's his name? That name just escaped my mind.
Vishwanath Chakravarti.
Yes, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. So there's a large block of Sanskrit that he quotes there. In fact, there is a commentary by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in which that passage of Sanskrit is to be found. Vamsidhar has word for word the same passage as part of his larger passage. Now, that means one of them is quoting the other, but I don't know who's quoting whom.
Contemporaries.
They would seem to be. So that's as much as I know. But the section in this appendix, I present a translation of the section which is found both in Vamsidhar and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. That's in the beginning part of the appendix. Basically what that is a detailed calculation of the diameter of Bhumandala, which refines, you might say, the Bhagavatam figures. They give slightly different figures than those contained in the Bhagavatam, and they explain why. Actually, the explanation given is that, you see, just to jump ahead a little bit, this 4 billion mile diameter disk is sitting within a spherical shell 4 billion miles in diameter. That's the description given. That means it goes right out to the edge of that shell. So what they did was give a little leeway between the edge of the disk and the shell. And they did that by adding up in detail the distances of different subcomponents of Bhumandala going radially outward. I won't go into that, but you can read it here. It's fairly complicated. And so they wound up, what was it? With a gap. How big is that gap?
17 lakhs.
Yeah. And they pointed out that that allowed the Earth to sink down into the Garbhodak Ocean. This, by the way, is an interesting point. Lord Varaha, of course, then lifted the Earth from the Garbhodak Ocean. That's mentioned in this section of Sanskrit that we're talking about. Now, you'll see portrayals in our books showing Lord Varaha lifting the Earth globe from an ocean. But in fact, Bhumandala is the entity being lifted from the ocean. And they describe here that by allowing some leeway around the edges, Bhumandala can move up and down. So therefore it can go into the ocean. So it wasn't just the little Earth globe.
What about all the other mandalas underneath it?
Well, you wonder, they may get a bit squashed. I guess they must be carried down with the Bhumandala, and they must go into the ocean also. It's like a stack of phonograph records. Yeah?
That's what happened, or that's what he said?
That's what he says. Both Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Vamsidhar, because it's the identical chunk of Sanskrit in each one's commentary.
The globe is described as being held on Varaha's tusks.
Well, Bhumandala is, the earth is held on Lord Varaha's tusks, but it turns out it's the whole Bhumandala disk which is involved here. That's the earth which is being lifted. That's what they say at any rate. So, he can hold more than just a little globe on his tusks also.
Big tusks.
Yeah.
Where does the ocean go? Does it, are the lower planetary systems within the ocean? Or?
Well, that was the other question. Presumably when the earth goes down, they have to be flooded also. I mean, it would make sense that they would have to be. So I'm going to be explaining a lot of these things. Where is this ocean? How do we relate that to the world as we know it? So right now I'm just giving some introductory material concerning this particular purport or commentary by Vamsidhar. So Vamsidhar is a commentator on the Bhagavatam. After this section, which he has in common with Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he goes on to give a much more detailed account. Basically, he first comes right out and says that there's a problem that people are confronting. Namely, that there seem to be two descriptions of the earth in Vedic literatures. One is the earth as a small egg of clay, and he specifically gives its diameter in yojanas. He uses the circumference. Pari-D is the word. So 5,000 yojanas in circumference. You can see if it's 5,000 yojanas in circumference, then, and it's 5 miles per yojana, that's 25,000 miles around. So he says there's this small 5,000 yojana earth, which is an egg of clay, he says. And then there's this big earth, Bhumandala, and that's 50 koti yojanas across. So how are we to understand that? He raises this question. Let us see. Let's see if I could quickly find. Yeah, here it is. This is one place where he says it. He says, well then, how can one explain the contradiction between the Bhagavata and the Jyotisha Shastra, or astronomical science? In the Bhagavata, Jambudvip is said to measure 100,000 yojanas. Jambudvip is just part of Bhumandala. Whereas the astronomical science states the entire earth to be measuring only 5,000 yojanas. The solution is given in the Gola Darsha. According to that text, some brief explanation is given below. So that's what he says. He goes on to give his explanation. I assume that Gola Darsha is a book that he wrote, or at least it's some kind of book, but I have no access to that book. So he then goes to give his understanding of how you relate the Bhumandala disk to the earth globe. So, as I do say here, I think that he's mistaken in certain respects about what he's saying. And that's part of the whole discussion within this book. Basically what he does is he says that the Bhumandala disk is a reflection of the earth globe. He resolves the apparent contradiction with what he calls this pratibimba tarka. Pratibimba means a reflection. And he argues that it's fairly complicated. It's presented in this appendix. But he argues that this large disk of Bhumandala is some kind of reflection. This creates a bit of a problem because, of course, according to the Bhagavatam, this Bhumandala is inhabited throughout its whole extent. So you have the problem of an inhabited reflection. So that's the situation there.
It's a simulated world.
Well, of course, there could be various ways in which you interpret the term reflection. Also, by the way, he cites some Vedic evidence concerning the position of the Jyotisha Shastra. Since I'm I hadn't exactly planned to speak about this, so I'm just looking for where I have the quotations here. But he mentions a Vedic quotation describing this. Let's see, where do we have? Oh, yeah. At one point he says, not indeed has the Jyotisha Shastra, or science of luminaries, started contravening the Puranic statement that Vyasa is Narayan himself, nor could Vyasa also have proceeded in contravention of the science of luminaries, which is the very eye of the Vedas, as expressed in the statement, astronomy is declared to be the eye of the Veda. Astronomy here is Jyotisha Shastra. I found what I think is that statement. The Sanskrit matches up. There's verse 1.4 of the Narada Samhita, which says, the excellent science of astronomy, comprising Siddhanta, Samhita, and Hora as its three branches, is the clear eye of the Vedas. So that statement is there. So he's pointing out that we seem to have this contradiction, which he wants to resolve. So the basic question then is this. We have this disk of Bhumandala, and we have the Earth globe. Now, to go further, I should describe Bhumandala in greater detail. Ultimately, the key to understanding what Bhumandala is and where it is based on the description of the different subdivisions of Bhumandala. So, I have a series of pictures in the book, computer generated. In the center of Bhumandala, there is a structure called Jambudvip. So Bhumandala is 4 billion miles across. This Jambudvip is in the very center of it, and it's 100,000 yojanas across. So it's fairly small. And because it is so small, it's practically a speck compared to the total size of Bhumandala. So I have a series of pictures illustrating that, beginning on page 49. What you see first is a picture of the plane of Bhumandala from a distance of 600 million miles from the center. Imagine you're in a spaceship, and you're up at a 45-degree angle above that plane, 600 miles out. That picture shows what you will see. It looks sort of like a bullseye with concentric rings. These rings are alternating islands and oceans. So the islands are called dvipas, it's a word for islands. And these all have different names. As you go out from the center, each successive dvipa becomes twice as big as the one within it. You can pretty much see how that goes in the diagram. And also each successive ring-shaped ocean becomes twice as wide as the one that was within it. So if you turn to the next page, now we look at the same thing from a distance of 150 million miles. And in the very center, you can barely see what is called Jambudvip. So to see Jambudvip better, you move in again. So figure 5, you see Bhumandala from 15 million miles. And you can begin to see what the structure of Jambudvip looks like in the center of that picture. And then finally, figure 6 on the next page, page 52, you get a close-up picture of Jambudvip. This is a computer-generated picture. It is based on it's entirely based on dimensions given in the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam. So everything is drawn to scale according to that description. Some things are left out, namely different mountain ranges and lakes and so on, for which no dimensions are given. So, because there were no dimensions, I wouldn't know where to put them in the picture exactly. But essential features for which dimensions are given are presented here. This Jambudvip is divided into 9 regions called varshas. And these are separated by mountain ranges. In the center, this inverted cone that you see sticking up is called Mount Meru. That is, 84 yojanas high from top to bottom. And there are various other structures here. The one last comment I'll make, because now it is getting late, is in figure 7, you'll see a mountain range stretching from A to B. So the height of that mountain range is about twice the diameter of the Earth as we know it. And that gives you an idea of the scale of the picture.
Say that again?
This mountain range that goes from A to B, if you look at the height of that, that's about twice the diameter of the Earth as we know it, of the Earth's globe. That's just to give you an idea of the scale of that picture. Yeah?
Actually, if these measurements could be given in some higher dimension, and then your pictures might not even have any basis in reality. Right? I mean, the measurements could be there, but they could be in different parts of higher dimensional space.
Well, I think the most coherent understanding of the Bhagavatam is that these dimensions relate to one another in three-dimensional space because they're so described. Because they're described in terms of north, east, west, up, down, and so on. So the whole description relates these different dimensions to one another in three-dimensional terms. So it seems most reasonable to assume that it's intended that way.
If you say that the height of the mountains from A to B is twice the diameter of the Earth, then in figure 9, you're saying that's a closer to Varsa lying at the foot of the Himalayan mountains.
Yes, that's right.
So that means that these mountains pictured in figure 9 are so many times more than the diameter of the Earth planet.
That's right.
On the Earth planet.
Not on the Earth planet exactly. So this is indeed a good question. This is indeed a good question. And that's what I'm going to be discussing tomorrow. Stay tuned tomorrow, and we'll try and tie it all together.